Hello, everyone, and welcome to the New Earth Lawyer podcast. I'm Geraldine Jones-Putra. I'm your host. I'm a lawyer based in Melbourne, Australia. Today, I'm speaking with David Cameron. He is the principal of David Cameron Law Office based in Hong Kong. David started his own law firm in order to better serve clients, and he provides advice on corporate transactions and financial law at a fixed fee. He's dual qualified in Hong Kong and New York. He's been based out of Hong Kong for 12 years, and he has worked for multiple UK Magic Circle law firms, in addition to being a partner at an AmLaw 100 US law firm. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Geraldine. It's nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
So am I. As we were talking just before we started recording, I was saying to you, I'm really interested in speaking to you because I did work in Hong Kong for a number of years. So I have a familiarity with the market there, the legal market. So I really wanted to hear from you what it's like being an innovative law professional in the Hong Kong market.
Yeah, and again, thank you for your time. I think that's a great question to start out with. And I think Hong Kong, and when I reference Hong Kong, I think it's also applicable to Singapore, are pretty unique legal markets in that you have the very large US and UK firms that have had a presence here for a very long time on one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have kind of the local firms, the Hong Kong firms that are more fragmented and maybe don't have that much international experience. And then you have this kind of big void in the middle in terms of lack of boutique international law firms in Hong Kong. And it's very interesting because, this market is just not conducive to someone like me. If you have a seasoned practitioner, chances are that he or she goes from one big firm to another big firm, or they go home to their home jurisdiction. You don't have somebody effectively starting a law firm in their garage, which is what I've done. I'm not in my garage, but to use the expression. Yeah. And then at the same time, there are barriers to entry here. You need to be a Hong Kong solicitor. And I just happened to take that test 4 years ago with no tangible benefits at the time. It's obviously paying dividends now. You need to have your own physical office. You can't do a virtual law firm. You can't have a service office like WeWork, so you do need to sign up for a proper office, so there's some capital outlay. And then other things like you need to buy insurance that's statutorily required. So you need to invest and then at the same time kind of have the wherewithal to know you'll have clients that will come to you. But as a result of all this, the fact that I'm in this unique space, there are a lot of smaller financial firms, and I put those in the categories of asset managers, family offices, companies that are maybe 5 years old, that have international legal needs, but aren't big enough to have their own in-house counsel. And that's the boutique law firm market that would normally be served. And I think you have that in Australia. Yeah. And I know you have that in the UK, and I know you have that in the States, but it's really lacking here. So I've kind of found myself in this market position where there's a lot of demand out there.
Are there any other regulatory impacts on you? So I'm thinking it's quite a traditional market, as you've described in some ways. There are restrictions on things like advertising and whether you can enter into a multidisciplinary partnership with non-lawyers. So that would hamper innovation, I would have thought. Are you finding that that's a challenge, or are you just not proceeding there yet?
It's a conservative market, I would say, yes, but there are still ways within those limitations to be innovative, and I don't think we're necessarily seeing that yet here in Hong Kong because of these two ends of the spectrum. And having recently, my firm is only 5 months old, having recently entered into this space, I think a lot of the innovation is actually coming out of Australia, the UK, and the US, and it's there, and people are coming up with these ideas and pricing and business models, and it's just who here in Hong Kong is going to take up those ideas and implement them. It's very hard to change if you're an older or larger institution, and for reasons I mentioned, there just aren't that many new law firms in this city.
Yeah, so it's a gap. It's waiting to be filled. You could be an early mover into it. I suppose that's the spot that you're finding yourself in. Is that why you decided to leave partnership and get into a new law practice?
No, and that's a good question. And I would like to say this is all part of a vision, and I had some sort of eureka moment. I'll just say that's not the case.
Yeah.
I think at different stages, I think it's always helpful to pause and ask yourself, why are you doing the things the way you're doing? If the answer is that's because the way they've always been done, I think you need to dive a little bit deeper into that. And if you don't know the original reason, then stress test it a little bit. Are there alternatives available? So I think I've done that along the way, and my career has progressed. And I think this last jump is really because even if you're at a big law firm, and maybe this is unique to my experience in Hong Kong, is even if you're at a big law firm with a brand and a platform and you have the resources, it's still very limiting in terms of how you can service your clients and what you can do. Because, if I hear of a good idea, out of Australia or elsewhere, then I can really think about implementing it and see if it better serves my clients.
Yeah, I think that's probably true of big law firms in other cities I've worked in. So I've also worked in London and Melbourne and Sydney. But I think you're right. There is something about the Hong Kong structure where the competition is so fragmented. It's not fragmented so much as segmented.
Yeah.
So you've got the big law firms, the American and UK law firms competing with each other, and then, like you said, the local law firms, and now lately the Chinese law firms coming in and setting up. And everyone sort of knows their place, and so no one really wants to break out of it, it seems to me. Whereas in places like Australia and the UK, because of the new law startups being more mature, really. I spoke to someone last week, Mel Lyon from Hive Legal. They've been going for 7 years. So that's relatively mature. And the sorts of innovations they're bringing to the market, big law has to respond.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a little bit of a privileged situation that the big end of town in Hong Kong have had, but you could see it in a couple, 3 years' time, really progressing to a point where they're going to have to take note of what you're doing and what other new law firms are doing. What's the competition that you see in your space then? Are there a lot more like you setting up?
There aren't a lot like me. So what I see in this client base, so put aside the global banks and institutions, if you have smaller size firms or companies in Hong Kong, I think they're really struggling to find a good fit in terms of somebody who could provide legal services.
Yeah. Okay.
And to your point to innovation, it doesn't have to be anything that big. It can be pretty small, simple concepts, and you apply them, and it's a way to differentiate yourself and better serve your clients. And some easy examples of what I've done is I have a board of external advisors. That's something that any law firm can do, and I think it's very uncommon. I'm working on my set of core values or core principles. Again, I think maybe that's more widespread, but I'm happy to talk about it. In terms of really implementing and living them, I don't think other law firms are doing that. And then I've also, a third example, just very simple things, and this is based on listening to your clients, is I've come up with a set of client commitments that I send to my clients at the opening of each engagement. So this is just me. I'm just one man band, and I think innovation, it's not necessarily thinking about, is it constrained by regulations, and are these difficult or capital intensive things to do? They're really not. And I think I need to do what I can to differentiate myself. So I'm looking to innovation, and some of it is very easy to implement, but firms aren't doing it.
This is very consistent, what you're talking about with your values, very consistent with the conversations I've been having with people who have left large law firms and either set up with others, boutique or niche practices, or set up on their own. And it's something that I've experienced myself, because I left a partnership in a law firm last November, and I've set up my own small practice, also on my own. So we're in a similar boat. And I know how I want to run my matters, and I know the conversations that I want to have with clients. I haven't gone so far, and I think it's a wonderful idea to tell my clients what my commitments are. But it's true alignment in my experience, and it's actually deeply fulfilling. Would you agree? And how, I suppose the next question I would go to, once you've told me what you think about what I've said about that alignment, is what's the reaction you're getting from your clients?
Yeah, so I agree with what you said, Geraldine, about alignment. And for me, at the outset of my firm, and similar to you perhaps, it's not only about attracting the right clients, it's also about being able to say no to certain type of work and certain clients as well, because that's how you get focused. And I think a lot of the at other law firms, it's very difficult to say no, and then you don't end up with clients who are aligned with what you want to accomplish or your skill sets. So I think it's important to get your messaging clear and consistent, and it's very hard to specialize, not in terms of attracting the target work that you're going after, but it's actually saying no to other work that may come in the door. So I think each firm, the more you can get your client commitments out there and your core values, then you really start to define yourself, and then you really start to end up with clients who are on the same page as you, and I think that's a win-win.
And when you say to your clients, these are my commitments to you, and I imagine that's around pricing, that you're going to listen to them, availability, responsiveness, and so on.
Yeah.
And I imagine that then it's not, you didn't workshop those with a big consulting firm and pay them lots of money to come up with that. You actually look deep into yourself to decide what you'd be comfortable with saying.
So just to describe client commitments and then core values in two separate buckets. So the client commitments I came up with are really not I don't want to say superficial, but very simple things. And I won't read them to you, but they're 12 commitments. It starts out, number one, I will be on time for meetings, which is really really means I do have to be on time for meetings. Another one is I will test my equipment so you can hear me clearly at the start of meetings. And the last one is from John Chisholm, who you've had on your show.
Yeah, fantastic inspiration.
And that gets into more substance in terms of you won't receive a bill from me that you haven't pre-authorized. But these are very common things. And with innovation, it doesn't necessarily need to be something brand new, but you're listening to feedback and what clients want. And if things are slipping in a certain direction, then clients really appreciate you reaffirming these basic things. So instead of taking traffic into account for client meetings, you need to take into account getting your equipment up and running. And what the people who may kind of think these are lighthearted things, the public announcement I have through your show is these are actually things that I hear from consumers of legal services, because I do this, it's a habit of mine. If it's a friendly environment or whatever, I ask person, like, what do you think of your lawyers these days? And so this list is based on that. And I hear stories about, I had a meeting with my lawyer, he or she was 5 minutes late, another 5 minutes to get the audio up and running, another 5 minutes to get the video, and then all of a sudden he's there and he's on his couch, and it seems like George Costanza from Seinfeld. And especially if you're billing by the hour, I mean, it's just, so those are my client commitments. I came up with them. I get an engagement letter signed and returned to me, and just proactively I say to clients, here are my commitments. These are for your record.
Yeah.
It's something I don't need to do, and it's one way. I think some just kind of file it away, and others really have a positive reaction to it. And then for my core values and core commitments, that goes into a book by Michael Morse called Fire Vaults. And he started his law firm, and at the time of publishing of that book, it was up to $160 million business in revenue. And he talks about a lot of things in terms of hiring and firing and putting teams together properly. And what he says about core values is, this is really the essence of your firm. So you can't just sit down and write what your core values are, start with number one, which is integrity. But this is something that you need to cultivate over time. So this is something my firm is new, so I've been thinking about these, but I haven't really put pen to paper yet. I think it's worth taking your time to get these right. The only one I've kind of settled on is, we only take on work that we're genuinely excited about.
Yeah.
And I'm sure all these big firms that I've been at you've been at, they have core values or core principles somewhere. But the difference is, the fact that I don't remember them means that they weren't truly implementing them, because if at every turn you should reference these so you're staying the course, and am I hiring these people pursuant to these principles? Am I letting them go? Am I forming these teams?
Who am I promoting to partner? When I promote to partner, am I actually testing them against these principles?
So those are the two. But, and again, just examples of innovation that's very easy to implement, and it makes a lot of sense. Same for my board of advisors, and we can talk about pricing too. But
yeah,
it takes an open mind to innovate. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of resources or capital. So that's where I've ended up.
What really fascinates me about what you were talking about with your coming up with your core values and taking your time about it is that I'm a big believer in values work and how that feeds into purpose. So I did my own values work 3-4 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, with a lady I had on the show. Kim Wright was my coach through it, and it wasn't an easy process. And I go back every now and again and I look at those values and I think, are those still my values? Yeah. But it actually guides me when I have tough decisions to make, or when I feel like I'm in an ethical dilemma. I actually go back and I think about the principles, the values, and I think, well, which one am I really emphasizing here? And there may be a trade-off between them, but I'll know why I'm making that trade-off, and it makes my decisions clear. It also makes me comfortable that I'm still being true to myself, that I'm not making one of those decisions where I'm just sort of closing one eye and going, oh, well, I think this is what I feel like doing, even though I don't think it's right. And I think that same thing, because you're working in a sole practice, would apply to your law firm. And I think it means that everything you do, even outside of commitments you make to your clients, but how you run your entire practice from the moment you kind of walk in the door, so to speak, to when you clock off, you'll be testing yourself against those values. And I think it just will create this incredibly integral sense. I would love to, catch up with you in a year's time and say, hey, David, have you got your values together, and see how it's going. I think it's a standard that could be set for many law firms. What you're doing.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's an important aspect of running the business. And I'm a solo practice right now. I hope to not be a solo practice for too much longer. And it's a matter of the people you bring on board.
Yeah.
Are they of the same wavelength? Because if they're not, it's not sustainable in the long run.
So let's get into the pricing conversation, because there have been a number of people I've had on now. I had John, obviously. I had Matthew Burgess, who runs a virtual law firm in Brisbane. And we've been talking about value pricing and how that goes. So I'd love to hear your experience talking to clients about it, and the reception that clients have had, and any quirks that you've seen come out of it.
Yeah, so value pricing, and just to mention how I got in this space, and I don't want to talk about the Bill Bauer as its own topic, but I didn't. So when I started my firm, I had the luxury of asking, what do I not want to do, and can I just do the things that I want to do? And obviously, there's some things by necessity you need to keep, but I decided the billable hour was not something I was going to adopt, right? And that was, people talk about efficiencies and incentives, but this was purely me not wanting to keep track of every 6 minutes of my working day. And I think that is not given enough emphasis that for lawyers, it's not something that I think any lawyer really wants to do. So anyway, I got rid of that. So then you get rid of that, and then you need to find an alternative. And that goes into fixed value pricing. And there's so many reasons why that makes sense. And then here in Hong Kong, I think it's a little bit easier, now that I've described the structure, is you think about it versus the alternatives. The client thinking about pricing versus the alternative. One is the big law firms, right? And they kind of have an idea of those prices. Another alternative is hiring their own in-house counsel. And a third alternative that you may not think of, which is kind of scary, is it's so expensive and not worthwhile that they don't reach out to legal counsel for that particular piece of work, or they end up trying to review it themselves. And there it's kind of the two costs. One is the potential liability, and the other is the opportunity costs of business people reading legal documents when they should be running the business. So from a value pricing perspective, it's not that, and my cost basis is completely different than the big law firms. So it's not that hard to price it in terms of transactional work and what I'm doing. And what's been interesting in terms of how this has naturally progressed, and this goes into where I am, today, and decisions that are being made this week, is you quickly go from value pricing on a transactional basis to really start understanding how the subscription model starts making sense. Because again, these companies, they genuinely need help, legal help. And if you think about reaching out to counsel, if they're reaching out when there's already a problem, that's too late. And if they're reaching out for a specific transaction, a lot of the time cost is getting up to speed, understanding the situation, understanding the background. So if you have somebody who's available to you, and it's not tied to hours, I think that opens up all sorts of efficiencies and meaningful client relationships that aren't transaction-based.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I wonder, there's something in what you said. It's if you're not tied to the billable hour, you also free up your time to make investments that may not be so obvious. So I'm thinking here around marketing, right? When I was in the Hong Kong market, there seemed to be a very standard way of going about marketing, which was to identify who you wanted to speak to, and then you'd go and set up meetings. You'd either go to their offices or you'd meet in one of the cafes or whatever, right? And there were just a lot of meetings that I remember being set up for business development, as well as the usual networking things that happen, AmCham and OzCham and so on, right? But have you decided to innovate marketing-wise, make an investment? For example, like this podcast I'm doing, it's not an obvious form of marketing for me. It's certainly I wouldn't be able to sell it to a partnership if I was a partner and say, I want to set up a podcast talking to lawyers about changing the legal practice. But it's actually paying off for me in different ways. It's making relations for me, and I'm getting opportunities elsewhere that could have a long-term effect. Are you seeing something like that in the way that you go about marketing because you're not tethered to the billable hour?
Yeah, I think so. Marketing from my perspective is you still need that personal touch and that personal engagement, but you can utilize technology to facilitate that. The mass marketing in terms of putting client updates out there. I'm just not in that space because the big law firms have entire departments that can put it out. So my marketing is more why my law firm and its profile is different than the bigger firms. So it kind of takes on a unique nature in that respect.
Yeah, and it's more authentic as well, going back to the conversation we were having about values. You can be yourself as well as thinking through things like your client commitments. Yeah. I was going to ask you about the advent of the China law firms into your market and whether that's going to have any changes around new law offerings.
It will definitely change the market, and it is changing the market. I'm not sure, I haven't thought about it before in terms of changing the new law market. I think the more variety and the more competition, the better. And the Chinese law firms have definitely made inroads, and they're getting a big presence. And they can offer capabilities in a variety of different jurisdictions. It's not just PRC. So they are making inroads that, at least at the start, is very China focused. But in terms of real disruptors, I don't know if they're necessarily in that category versus an alternative to the US or UK firms.
Yeah. I suppose they are disrupting a different segment of the market. It was that segment that the big law firms were trying to get into through their China practices. And then the Chinese law firms sort of arrived in Hong Kong. So it's probably a different segment, but a shake-up all the same. And there's another trend that I've been observing as I talk to new law firms based in Australia mainly, and that is the response of young lawyers, law students coming through. So I'd be interested to know what you're seeing, especially given in Hong Kong the last 2-3 years we've had so much going on at the university campuses with the protests. What's the feeling of young lawyers and the traditional law model?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's very pertinent because I've been looking into starting the hiring process, and that would be somebody junior. I've been talking to a lot of people in the industry, and I think it's unique, and I think their needs and what they want is really going to drive change in this industry, because older people can refer to them as millennials, and they don't know how to work hard, but I think they're actually quite smart about things. And interlaid on top of all this is COVID and flexible working, and people realizing that you can do a lot remotely, and who knows how this is going to look once the pandemic is over. But I think look, these people going through law school and coming into this industry, I think they're very smart. I think they're going to see through a lot of the things that don't necessarily need to be there.
Yeah.
So in terms of attracting them, I think the intangibles and what you have to offer, and I'm not just talking about work-life balance, but in terms of career progression, investment in them, I think that's going to be very important. And, law firms, if they want to attract the best people, it's not going to be about the highest pay necessarily moving forward. So they're going to need to rebalance what they have to offer to people coming into this industry.
Yeah, my observation of the Hong Kong market when I was there was, obviously, if you're working with a Magic Circle law firm or similar, the hours are extremely long.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're working in Hong Kong or Shanghai or London or New York. But in Hong Kong, my observation was that it wasn't just the big end of town where the hours were just horrendous.
Mm-hmm.
All through the Hong Kong culture, there is a perception that you will work as hard as it takes. Is that, are you seeing that, like we talked about work-life balance, are you seeing that that's really starting to shift?
Yeah, I think that's starting to shift, and I don't know if I can't say for certain whether it's the law firms being proactive or if it's if it's them being reactive. But I think, okay, so you work a lot of hours, and people say that's fine because that's what I signed up to. I want to make a lot of money, and I want to work at a good firm and do the headline transactions. But I think that starts to lose a little bit of its basis when you realize that things can be done a lot more efficiently.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of the traditional things in terms of going into the physical office, a lot of inefficiencies, they just kind of fall to the wayside. So I think whether they're thinking about the billable hour or not, I think people coming into this industry are realizing that they have other things to trade than their time, and they're very smart about it. I think law firms are going to be in a pinch where you kind of need to offer top dollar just to attract them, and then offer the intangibles to retain them.
Yeah,
and that's what I've been learning the past couple of weeks.
So, if I could ask you then, with your experience, having worked with large law firms, having been a partner at a large law firm, and now being a sole practitioner, what would be your advice to a young lawyer just starting out and thinking, well, maybe I could do things differently?
Yeah, so not that I'm in a position to give anyone advice, but
I think you are. I think you've had very varied experience, and I think particularly given that you're in a market that isn't traditionally thought or isn't conventionally thought of as being very innovative.
Yeah, I think just some practical things before getting into more innovative things. But I think be mindful to the amount of debt you're taking on to get an education, because that's a trap that a lot of students get into very quickly, and then you need to go into a high-paying profession, and anything beyond that you had in mind is kind of eliminated. Other practical things is think about what industry you're going into and whether there's longevity and whether there's a lot of competition. Kind of find your niche. And then on the innovative aspect, I mean, it's hard to say because this industry, I think, is going to change so rapidly. But I think just evaluate your options, because it's going, working at David Cameron Law Office is not going to be for everyone. But do you want to work with a partner level person who will invest time in you and think through the different business models out there? Because you working at my firm are going to be a fixed cost, and your time spent on things is not going to matter to me. So I'm going to train you to be as efficient and as good as possible, because I want you to produce things high quality in short amount of time if possible. I think that ties into, I need you to be well rested every day, right? Get your sleep. So hopefully the industry provides enough alternatives for people coming in this industry to have more to choose from, right? It's not just one big UK firm versus another big UK firm, but it's, Chinese firms that you mentioned, local Hong Kong firms that are getting more international, startup firms. I think just the more choices available to people, the better, because it's going to be a different fit for each person.
Yeah, that diversification is needed. So that's what's happened in Australia. I'm sure it's happened in the UK, and Hong Kong really is just right for it. The whole ecosystem needs to have more variation within it, because like you said, the law students coming out, the young lawyers, they're looking for that variation or that variety, and they won't put up with the old model for much longer, I don't think.
Yeah, and if law firms don't kind of lead this change, you're going to have consulting firms coming into the legal space. You're going to see companies that do fund formation or company formation, and all of a sudden they have legal teams associated with them.
Yeah.
So it's not just in the law firm space. If we don't kind of drive this change, there are going to be competitors that are already here and looking to expand.
Yeah. But I like what you're saying about your model, which is something that I'd been thinking on as well when I was pondering on what's the role for the large law firms, apart from being the provider of large scale projects, expertise in that space. I was thinking that they actually provide a great training ground. Yeah. But then I turned that around and I thought, well, yes and no, because the training that you're offering is the master apprentice type of training, which you don't really get at large law firms anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a really unique offering for a law student coming in, and would be very interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, there are holes in this, but if you take any law firm, even the biggest law firm, and they had teams of 3 people, and the whole firm was made up of teams of 3 people, and that was a partner, senior associate, and junior associate, and timeless firm, because you can't do this on the billable hour. But you're hired with the expectation that the junior will replace the mid-level, the mid-level will replace the partner, and then tie bonuses to each other and the performance, the revenue performance of the partner. And then you're getting into really aligned incentives in terms of training and investing in people below you. I think at big law firms where you're leveraging, the fact that there are 8 associates for every partner, for example, then, just look at those numbers, and not everyone is going to make partner. And then, are you investing the same amount in each person?
Yeah.
If they were, at least the intention was for them to rise up the ranks.
Excellent point. Well, David, I really appreciate you finishing that on that point, because that's giving me food for thought. I want to congratulate you on setting up David Cameron Law Office. And I really, like I said, I hope to speak to you in a year's time and hear of your continuing success. Thank you for being on the show.
Okay. Thank you for your time.